The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Aisha opened her eyes. Today was the day her big adventure would begin. At 35, she had already seen more of the world than most people do in a lifetime. As a university professor who taught about different cultures, Aisha had visited over 30 countries. She had slept in grass huts in remote villages, shared meals with families in mountain towns, and documented traditions that were slowly fading away as the world changed. But there was something that always bothered her whenever she returned home to her apartment in the big city. How could she know so much about faraway places but so little about her own country? It felt like a gap in her life story that needed to be filled. Time to change that, she said to herself as she zipped up the last of her 3 suitcases. The road trip had been on her mind for nearly a year. She had saved up vacation days, arranged for a colleague to cover her summer classes, and spent countless evenings planning her route. Her small blue car was packed with everything she might need: comfortable clothes for different weather, hiking boots, a good camera, and more snacks than any one person could reasonably eat. Aisha ran her finger along the highlighted path on her paper map. She preferred these to GPS, enjoying the feeling of physically tracing her journey. The route would take her through states she had only flown over before, with stops at natural wonders, historical sites, and tiny towns that most tourists never bothered to visit. The small southern town of Oak Ridge wasn't originally part of her plan. It was a dot on the map she would have driven right past if not for Dr. Chen, a fellow professor who had stopped there during his own travels last year. "Trust me," he had told her, showing pictures on his phone of tree-lined streets and buildings that looked frozen in time. The downtown area is like stepping back 100 years, but in a good way. And the food at Cooper's restaurant is worth the detour alone. By late afternoon on the 3rd day of her trip, Aisha's shoulders ached from driving, and her eyes were tired from watching the endless stretch of highway. The turnoff for Oak Ridge appeared just as she was considering finding a motel for the night. Perfect timing, she thought, following the signs to the town center. Oak Ridge was exactly as Dr. Chen had described. The main street looked like something from an old movie, with brick buildings, actual lampposts, and small shops with hand-painted signs. People walked at a relaxed pace, stopping to chat with each other on the sidewalk. It was different from the rush of city life that Aisha was used to. She found a small hotel with a vacancy sign and checked in, grateful for the chance to stretch her legs and wash away the dust of the road. After a quick shower and change of clothes, her stomach reminded her that lunch had been a hastily eaten sandwich at a rest stop hours ago. "Excuse me," she asked the older man at the hotel desk. "Is Cooper's restaurant far from here?" "Just 3 blocks down and 1 over," he replied with a friendly smile. "Can't miss it. It's the place with the green awning and always a line out front." As Aisha walked through the town in the golden evening light, she felt a sense of peace. This was why she had planned this trip, to discover these hidden corners of her own country, to connect with places she only read about in books. The restaurant was indeed easy to spot, just as the hotel clerk had said. Through the large front windows, she could see that almost every table was full, always a good sign when looking for a place to eat. Her mouth watered at the thought of a hot, delicious meal after days of travel snacks and fast food. What Aisha couldn't know as she reached for the door handle was that this ordinary stop on her journey was about to become something much more significant. The meal she was about to have wouldn't just fill her stomach, it would change lives, including her own. Sometimes the most important moments happen in the most unexpected places, and for Aisha, this restaurant in this quiet town was about to become the setting for one of those moments. She took a deep breath, pulled open the heavy wooden door, and stepped inside. The warm air inside Cooper's restaurant hit Aisha's face, carrying the smell of fresh bread and grilled meat. The place buzzed with the sounds of clinking glasses, laughter, and friendly chatter. For a moment, she stood by the entrance, taking it all in. The walls were covered with old black and white photos of the town, and ceiling fans spun lazily overhead. As she waited to be seated, Aisha noticed something change. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on at first, just a feeling. A few conversations nearby seemed to pause. Some folks glanced her way, then quickly looked down at their plates. Others stared a little too long before turning back to their meals. Aisha had felt this shift in the air many times before in her travels. That tiny change when you walk into a place and people realize you're not from around there. Usually, it passed quickly, replaced by normal curiosity or friendly welcome. She took a deep breath and reminded herself not to jump to conclusions. A young woman with a bright smile approached. "Table for one?" she asked, grabbing a menu from the stack. "Yes, please," Isha replied. "Right this way," the hostess said, leading her through the maze of tables. Most of the diners had returned to their conversations, though a few eyes still followed her path across the room. The hostess stopped at a small table near the back. "Your server will be with you shortly," she said, placing the menu down and heading back to her post. From across the room, Melissa watched the new customer being seated in her section. She'd been waiting tables at Cooper's for 15 years, since she was just 19. The restaurant was her second home, the regular customers like extended family. Today had already been rough, short-staffed again, a table that complained about perfectly good food and personal problems weighing heavy on her mind. Now this. Another table to serve when she was already stretched thin. Melissa made her way over, taking her time. She stopped to refill water at another table, chatted briefly with the cook through the service window, and straightened a stack of napkins that didn't need straightening. When she finally reached Aisha's table, she didn't make eye contact. "What can I get you to drink?" she asked flatly, her pen poised above her notepad. "Just water, please," Aisha said. "And could you tell me what today's special is?" "I don't see it on the menu." Melissa sighed loudly. "It's written on the chalkboard by the entrance. Catfish with 2 sides. I'll get your water." She walked away before Aisha could thank her. At the table next to her, an older couple exchanged looks. The woman frowned slightly and shook her head. When Melissa returned with the water, she practically dropped it on the table, causing some to splash onto the wooden surface. She didn't bother to wipe it up. "Ready to order?" she asked, still not meeting Aisha's eyes. "I'm trying to decide between the chicken and dumplings or the special," Aisha said with a friendly smile, trying to establish some connection. "Which would you recommend?" Melissa finally looked at her then, her face tight with something that might have been annoyance or might have been something else entirely. "They're both food. They'll both fill you up," she muttered. At the table behind them, a man cleared his throat uncomfortably. Around the restaurant, more people were starting to notice the strange interaction. The manager, a balding man with kind eyes, glanced over from behind the counter where he was tallying receipts. "I'll have the chicken and dumplings then," Aisha said, her voice still pleasant despite the growing tension. Melissa scribbled on her pad, then grabbed the menu roughly. As she turned to leave, she bumped the table, causing more water to spill. Under her breath, but just loud enough for Aisha and nearby tables to hear, she mumbled, always making extra work. The couple at the next table now stared openly, their faces showing concern. Across the room, 2 young women whispered to each other, glancing over with worried expressions. A heaviness settled over this corner of the restaurant, a sharp contrast to the cheerful atmosphere elsewhere. Aisha sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. This wasn't the first time she'd experienced poor service, but something felt different about this situation. More personal, more deliberate. She considered asking for another server or even leaving, but something kept her in her seat. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was hunger after a long day of driving. Or maybe it was the professor in her, curious about what was happening beneath the surface in this seemingly picture-perfect town. Whatever the reason, she stayed put, unaware that the uncomfortable situation was about to escalate into something that would leave a lasting mark on everyone in the restaurant that evening. The minutes crawled by as Aisha waited for her food. Around her, other tables that had been seated after her were already enjoying their meals. She watched as Melissa cheerfully served a family at the far end of the restaurant, joking with the kids and bringing extra napkins without being asked. The contrast between that treatment and what Aisha was experiencing became impossible to ignore. She tried to keep herself busy by scrolling through photos on her phone from earlier in her trip. The stunning sunset over the mountains 2 days ago. The funny-shaped rock formation she'd hiked to see yesterday morning. The roadside fruit stand where the owner had insisted she taste 3 different kinds of peaches before deciding which to buy. Aisha was so focused on her phone that she didn't notice Melissa approaching until a plate clattered onto the table in front of her. The chicken and dumplings had been hastily served, with some of the gravy spilled over the edge of the plate. "Anything else?" Melissa asked, already half-turned to walk away. "Actually," Aisha said, "could I get some sweet tea? And maybe some extra napkins." She pointed to the small puddle of gravy on the table. Melissa's lips tightened into a thin line. She grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby empty table and dropped them next to Aisha's plate. "Sweet tea," she said, not as a question but like she was adding it to a mental list of annoyances. As Melissa walked toward the drink station, the couple at the next table caught Aisha's eye. The woman gave her an apologetic smile and shook her head slightly, as if to say, "I'm sorry about this." When Melissa returned with the tea, she placed it on the table with slightly more care than she had shown with the food. Aisha decided to try one more time to break through whatever wall the waitress had put up. "This chicken and dumplings looks delicious," she said. "Is it made from a local recipe? I'm traveling through the area and trying to experience authentic local food wherever I go." Something flickered in Melissa's eyes, surprise, perhaps, that Aisha was still attempting friendly conversation, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by the same cold stare. "It's just chicken and dumplings," she replied. "Nothing special." "I was also wondering," Aisha continued, undeterred, "if you could recommend which of these two desserts is better, the peach cobbler or the chocolate cake. I can never decide between fruit desserts and chocolate." That was when it happened. Maybe it was the long day catching up with Melissa. Maybe it was personal troubles bubbling over. Or maybe it was something uglier that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. Whatever the cause, Melissa's face suddenly twisted with anger. "Why don't you just go back to Africa and eat whatever they serve there?" she snapped, her voice loud enough to carry across the nearby tables. The restaurant fell completely silent. A fork dropped somewhere, the metallic clatter against a plate sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. A child's voice started to ask a question, quickly hushed by a parent's urgent whisper. Aisha sat perfectly still, the shock of the moment washing over her like cold water. In all her travels, in all the uncomfortable situations she'd navigated, she had rarely encountered such naked hostility expressed so publicly. Every eye in the place was now fixed on their corner of the restaurant. Some people looked horrified, others embarrassed. A few older customers near the window stared down at their plates, suddenly very interested in their food. The manager, who had been walking by with a coffee pot in hand, froze mid-step. His face drained of color as he processed what his employee had just said to a customer. The coffee pot in his hand tilted dangerously before he caught himself and set it down on a nearby table. "Melissa," he said, his voice tight with shock and anger. But Melissa didn't seem to hear him. She stood glaring at Aisha, her chest rising and falling rapidly, as if the words that had escaped her had broken some internal dam. Her hands were trembling. For Aisha, time seemed to slow down. She was aware of everything at once, the shocked faces around her, the flush creeping up Melissa's neck, the manager stepping forward, a young busboy watching with his mouth open, the couple next to her half rising from their seats as if unsure whether to intervene. In this suspended moment, Aisha knew that what happened next would define not just this meal, not just this day, but something much larger. How she responded would be remembered by everyone in this restaurant. It would become the story they told about the day a stranger came to town. She took a deep breath and unclenched her hands, which she hadn't realized she had balled into fists. Every person in the restaurant held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Aisha felt like she was standing at a crossroads, though she hadn't moved from her chair. Her heart pounded in her chest. The chicken and dumplings in front of her no longer looked appetizing. The sweet tea she had asked for sat untouched, beads of condensation rolling down the glass. In moments like these, time does something strange. It stretches out, giving you more of it than you'd expect. In that stretched out time, Aisha's mind raced through all her possible reactions. She could get up and leave, just walk out the door and never look back. Find another place to eat, maybe even drive to the next town. Nobody would blame her. She could demand to speak to the manager, though he was already standing there, his face showing he had heard everything. She could insist that Melissa be fired on the spot. She had every right. She could raise her voice, let her anger show. Tell this woman and everyone else in the restaurant exactly what she thought about that comment. She could point out the ignorance, the hurt, the utter wrongness of it all. Any of these reactions would have been completely justified. Anyone watching would understand. But as these options flashed through her mind, Aisha remembered something her grandmother used to tell her. When someone throws their darkness at you, you have a choice. You can throw your darkness back at them, or you can show them your light. But remember, child, only one of those choices leaves both of you in the dark. Her grandmother had lived through times when words like those just thrown at Aisha were backed up by laws, not just ugly attitudes. She had faced worse than this and somehow kept her dignity, her humanity. Aisha also thought about her students back at the university. She often told them that the true test of what you believe comes when you're hurt or angry. It's easy to talk about understanding and compassion when everything is going well. The challenge is living those values when they're the hardest thing to reach for. And there was something else, something she had noticed in Melissa's eyes just before the awful words came out, something that looked like pain. Aisha had seen that look before in villages torn apart by conflict, in refugee camps, in places where hurt people because they didn't know what else to do with their pain. None of this excused what Melissa had said. Nothing could. But it helped Aisha see past her own hurt to make a choice that came from who she wanted to be, not just how she felt in the moment. The manager stepped forward, his face tight with anger and embarrassment. "Ma'am, I am so incredibly sorry. This is absolutely unacceptable. Melissa, go to my office right now." His voice shook slightly. Before Melissa could move or the manager could say anything else, Aisha raised her hand. The simple gesture somehow commanded attention, and everyone froze. The older couple next to her watched with wide eyes. The family with children across the room had gone completely still. Even the cooks had come out from the kitchen, drawn by the sudden silence that had fallen over the usually bustling restaurant. Aisha could feel the weight of all those eyes on her. What she did next wouldn't just affect her and Melissa. It would touch everyone watching. It would become a story told over dinner tables and phone calls tonight. "Did you hear what happened at Cooper's today?" She thought about the ripples that would spread from this moment, like circles in a pond when you drop in a stone. How far would they go? How many people would they touch? She remembered a quote from a book she'd read to her students just before leaving on this trip. Every time you make a choice, you're not just choosing what to do at that moment. You're choosing what kind of person to become. What kind of person did she want to be in this story? Aisha took another deep breath. Her hands had stopped shaking. The initial shock was wearing off, leaving behind a clarity that surprised her. She looked directly at Melissa, whose angry expression had begun to falter, perhaps as she realized what she had said out loud in front of everyone. This wasn't just about responding to a hateful comment. This was about breaking a cycle. This was about showing that there was another way to handle hurt than to pass it along. Aisha straightened her back and unclenched her jaw. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what this stranger, this woman who had been so publicly insulted, would do next. In her mind, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, gentle but firm. "Show them your light, child. Show them your light." A strange calm settled over Aisha as she made her decision. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and carried throughout the silent restaurant, though she wasn't speaking loudly. "I'd be happy to tell you about the amazing cuisine in various African countries," she said with genuine warmth in her voice. "The continent has 54 countries, each with its own food traditions. But first," she paused, looking directly at Melissa, whose face had begun to shift from anger to confusion at this unexpected response. "I'd like to hear about what's troubling you today. It seems like you're carrying something heavy." If the silence before had been tense, now it was stunned. The manager's mouth actually dropped open slightly. The couple at the next table exchanged glances of disbelief. Nobody had expected this. Melissa certainly hadn't expected it. She stood frozen, order pad still clutched in her hand. The flush that had colored her face with anger now seemed to change character, becoming something closer to shame. Her eyes, which had been narrowed with hostility, widened with surprise. "What?" she managed to say, the single word barely audible. "Something's obviously wrong," Aisha continued, her tone conversational, as if they were just two people talking, not the center of a public scene. "The way you've been all evening, that's not just about me, is it? I'm guessing today was already hard before I walked in." A young man who had been about to take a bite of pie put his fork down slowly, glancing around as if to say, "Are you all hearing this too?" Melissa swallowed hard. Her hand holding the order pad began to tremble slightly. "I don't need your," she began, but her voice had lost its edge. She couldn't seem to finish the sentence. "My concern," Aisha supplied gently. "Maybe not, but I'm offering it anyway." The manager, who had been about to step in again, hesitated. He looked back and forth between the two women, clearly unsure how to proceed with this unexpected turn of events. Melissa's eyes darted around the restaurant, suddenly aware that everyone was watching, listening. Her shoulders, which had been tight and raised, slowly began to lower. Something in her seemed to deflate, not in defeat, but as if a burden was becoming too heavy to carry alone. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but there was no bite in the words now. They sounded more like a tired statement of fact than an accusation. "You're right," Isha agreed. "I don't, but I know what pain looks like. I've seen it in villages across the world, in big cities, in all kinds of faces, and I can see it in yours right now." A tear suddenly spilled down Melissa's cheek, catching her by surprise. She wiped it away quickly, almost angrily, but another followed. She took a step back, as if trying to retreat from this moment, from this stranger who had somehow seen through her anger to something underneath. "I can't do this right now," she whispered, her voice breaking. She turned to hurry toward the back of the restaurant. "Melissa, wait," the manager called, starting to follow her. "Let her have a moment," Aisha suggested quietly. "Sometimes we need space when our walls start coming down." The manager nodded slowly, then turned to Aisha. "Ma'am, I don't even know what to say. I am so sorry for how you've been treated. Your meal is on the house, of course, and if there's anything else I can do—" "It's okay," Aisha said. "I think there's more going on here than just a bad interaction." Around the restaurant, people began to whisper to each other. Aisha could catch fragments. "Did you see that?" "I would have thrown my drink in her face. Never in all my years. Who is this woman?" The older woman at the next table leaned over. "I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what you just did," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Most people would have—" She shook her head, not finishing the thought. "Most people would have responded to hurt with more hurt," she said. "It's the natural reaction, but it rarely makes anything better." The back door of the restaurant opened and Melissa reappeared. Her face was still tear-stained, but there was a new determination in her step as she walked directly to Aisha's table. The restaurant fell silent again. Melissa stopped a few feet away, as if unsure how close she should come. She took a deep breath. "I need to say something," she began, her voice unsteady but clear enough to be heard. "What I said to you was wrong. So wrong. There's no excuse for it." She paused, obviously struggling to continue. "I've never said anything like that to anyone before. Never. I don't know why I—" She stopped, overcome for a moment. Aisha waited patiently, not jumping in to fill the silence. "You were right," Melissa finally continued. "Something did happen today, something bad. But that's not on you. None of this is on you, and I'm so sorry." In that moment, with those simple words, something shifted in the restaurant. You could almost feel it, a heaviness lifting, a tension easing. Not gone completely, but changing into something else, something with the possibility of understanding. Aisha nodded, acknowledging the apology. "Thank you," she said simply. "Would you like to sit down for a minute?" And to everyone's surprise, including perhaps her own, Melissa nodded and pulled out the chair across from Aisha. The chair scraped against the wooden floor as Melissa sat down across from Aisha. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Around them, the restaurant remained unusually quiet, everyone still watching, still listening, though some were trying to pretend they weren't. The manager hovered nearby, unsure whether to give them privacy or stay close in case things went badly again. Sensing his uncertainty, Aisha glanced up at him with a small nod, silently telling him it was okay to step back. Melissa's hands fidgeted with a napkin on the table, folding and unfolding the corners. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low that Aisha had to lean forward to hear her. "I got a phone call this morning," she began, her eyes fixed on the napkin in her hands. "From my son, Bobby." Aisha noticed the slight tremble in Melissa's fingers as she continued to fold the napkin into smaller and smaller squares. "He's in the military. Army. He joined right after high school, about 3 years ago. A hint of pride crept into her voice despite her obvious distress. He's my only child. Raised him by myself after his dad left when he was 4. Melissa paused, taking a shaky breath. Bobby called to tell me he's being deployed. Next week. To. Her voice caught. To a place where there's fighting. Real fighting. Not a training mission or peacekeeping like before. A tear slipped down her cheek again, but this time she didn't try to wipe it away. He couldn't tell me exactly where, just that it's dangerous, that I shouldn't watch the news too much because it would just worry me more. She let out a small, humorless laugh. As if that's possible. Aisha nodded, understanding washing over her. That's a very heavy thing to carry, she said softly. I've been a mess all day, Melissa continued. Couldn't sleep after his call. Came to work because I needed the money and didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. Then everything kept going wrong. Orders mixed up, a table that complained about everything, my feet killing me from these new shoes. She finally looked up from the now mangled napkin and met Aisha's eyes directly. But that doesn't excuse what I said, not at all. I've never said anything like that to anyone in my life. Her voice cracked with shame. My son would be so disappointed in me. I raised him better than that. I'm better than that. At least, I thought I was. The manager, who had been listening from a respectful distance, stepped forward again. Melissa, I think maybe you should take the rest of the night off. Melissa nodded, starting to rise. I understand. And I'll clean out my locker. I know I can't keep working here after this. That's not what I meant, the manager said quickly. I just meant tonight. You're obviously going through something terrible. Go home, get some rest. We can talk tomorrow. Surprise flashed across Melissa's face. She looked from the manager to Aisha, confusion evident in her expression. You're not firing me? She asked in disbelief. After what I said? In front of everyone? The manager hesitated, clearly torn. It was Aisha who spoke up. Fear can make us unrecognizable sometimes, she said thoughtfully. Even to ourselves, especially to ourselves. What matters is what we do after we see that side of ourselves. She looked at the manager. I don't think firing her solves anything. Not for her, not for your restaurant, not for this community. The older couple at the next table, who had been listening intently, nodded in agreement. The woman leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him nod more vigorously. What you said was wrong, Aisha continued, turning back to Melissa. But I understand that your fear for your son got twisted up into anger, and I happened to be the person it landed on. Melissa shook her head, fresh tears welling up. That's just it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand it myself. I've served all kinds of people in this restaurant for 15 years. Never had a problem. Never wanted to have a problem. When you walked in, I didn't even. She struggled to find the words. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I was thinking. It just came out, like something ugly that had been hiding inside me that I didn't even know was there. Aisha nodded slowly. We all have shadows inside us, parts we don't like to look at, biases we've picked up without realizing it. The true test isn't whether those parts exist, it's what we do when they show themselves. The manager pulled up a chair and joined them at the table, sensing that something important was happening. Something that went beyond a customer complaint or an employee discipline issue. I'm ashamed, Melissa admitted, looking around at the restaurant full of people who had witnessed her worst moment. So ashamed, but also grateful. She turned back to Aisha with wonder in her tear-stained face. You could have gotten me fired, could have made a huge scene, could have thrown your drink in my face. Nobody would have blamed you. Aisha smiled slightly. That wouldn't have helped your son come home safely. And it wouldn't have made my chicken and dumplings taste any better. A ripple of surprised laughter spread through the nearby tables. The atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift again, the tension continuing to dissolve with each passing moment. I can't take back what I said, Melissa said, but I can promise you it will never happen again. To anyone. And I can thank you for showing me something about myself that I needed to see, even though it hurts to look at it. The rest of the evening at Cooper's restaurant unfolded in a way no one could have predicted just an hour earlier. After their conversation, Melissa went home to process everything that had happened, while Aisha stayed to finish her meal. But it wasn't the quiet dinner she had expected. The manager insisted that everything be on the house. "It's the least we can do," he said, his face still showing traces of embarrassment over what had happened. He personally brought out a fresh plate of chicken and dumplings, along with every dessert on the menu. "I couldn't decide which one to bring you," he admitted with a small smile. What surprised Aisha most was how the other diners reacted. The older couple next to her introduced themselves and asked if they could join her. A family from across the room sent over a glass of wine. A young man who had been sitting at the counter came by to tell her that he was a teacher at the local high school and that he would be sharing this story with his students. "Not with names, of course," he clarified. "But the lesson, that's something they need to hear." Throughout the evening, people stopped by her table, some just to say hello, others to share their own stories. A middle-aged woman told Aisha about growing up as the only Asian kid in town in the 1980s. An elderly man talked about how the town had changed over his lifetime, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. "What you did tonight," one woman said softly, "made a difference, and not just for Melissa." By the time Aisha finally left the restaurant, she had a dozen invitations to local events, recommendations for places to visit, and 3 homemade jams that a farmer had run home to get for her. She walked back to her hotel room feeling both exhausted and oddly energized, wondering if she ever experienced such an intense range of emotions in a single meal. She decided to stay in town an extra day. Something about the place now pulled at her, a curiosity about what might happen next, a feeling that there was more to discover here than just historic buildings and local cuisine. The next morning, as she enjoyed breakfast at a small cafe, Aisha was surprised when Melissa walked in. Their eyes met, and after a moment's hesitation, Melissa came over. "I wasn't looking for you," she said quickly. "This is where I always get coffee before my shift, but I'm glad I ran into you." Aisha gestured to the empty chair across from her, and Melissa sat down. "I spent most of the night thinking," Melissa said. "About what happened. About what you said. About a lot of things." She took a deep breath. "I called my son too. Told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that hit me hard." She paused, looking down at her hands. "He said, 'Mom, I'm over here fighting so people can be treated with dignity. Don't make me feel like I'm fighting for nothing.'" Aisha nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "Anyway," Melissa continued, "I wanted you to know that I'm going to do better. Be better, starting today." 6 months later, Aisha was surprised to receive an email from the manager of Cooper's restaurant. He'd gotten her address from the hotel where she had stayed. The email contained just a few lines and a photo. The picture showed Melissa standing with a group of people outside the town's community center. They were holding a banner that read, "Oak Ridge Cultural Exchange Program." The manager's message explained that after what happened that night, Melissa had started attending town council meetings. She proposed a program to bring people from different backgrounds to speak at local schools and community events. The email ended with, "She always starts the story by telling people about the night a stranger showed her more kindness than she deserved, and how sometimes that's all it takes to see yourself clearly." A year after that first visit, Aisha found herself driving through the same region again. She hadn't planned to return to Oak Ridge, but as the exit approached on the highway, she made a spontaneous decision to take the turnoff. Cooper's restaurant looked the same from the outside. Inside, though, she noticed changes. A bulletin board near the entrance displayed flyers for community events, including one announcing an upcoming African cooking class. As she stood looking at it, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "I was hoping you might come back someday," Melissa said. When Aisha turned, she saw a woman transformed, not just by the genuine smile on her face, but by the lightness in her eyes. The heaviness Aisha had sensed during their first meeting was gone. "My son came home safe," Melissa said, "and I've been trying to make sure I was worthy of that blessing." As they sat down together for a meal, this time as friends rather than strangers, Aisha thought about how a single moment, a single choice, could change so much. Not just for one person, but for an entire community. Sometimes the greatest journeys aren't across countries or continents, but across the small distances between people's hearts.